good to see you guys again. So I know it's been a little while. I guess maybe at least since chapel, but always good to see you. So the first time I gave this lecture was on the 2014 trip, so I guess 4 years ago. And it was while we were in Oxford. We had toured Oxford that day and visited the Kilns, which is the name of kind of the C.S. Lewis estate where he lived and where he died. And so it was at the hotel afterwards that evening. We all kind of met kind of in the courtyard. Not even courtyard, it's way too much for this hotel. Tables in the backyard. And about 50 yards behind us, I kept hearing this voice, and I saw the students looking behind me. I knew something was going on, but there was this shirtless Englishman who was hanging out his window the entire time I'm giving this lecture, heckling me the entire time. I'm just looking at him like, what are you doing, right? He's like, got his arms out, stop, he's telling lies, all this stuff. Right? I'm like, all right, great, I'm getting heckled. So we decided for 2016 to move the C.S. Lewis lecture, tongue twister, stateside. So I did this last year, and I guess 2 years ago, and doing it again. So what you have is, the side you want to focus on the most is the outline. This is, I'm going straight down this, so this should give you an idea just for pacing about where I'm at. So my recommendation, by the way, you're going to need to keep this in your portfolio. I think that's what you guys have to turn in on the trip. And so if you want to, I'm going through this. You can take some notes on here if you want. One thing as far as an assignment that we're going to, Ms. Zeffo is going to be looking for at the end is these discussion questions. That'll be a part of your portfolio at the end. So I want to read those ahead of time because they're not just like simple one-word answer questions. It takes some reflection. So let me read these so you're kind of thinking about them before I start the lecture. So discuss C.S. Lewis's 3 experiences as a child as it relates to the concept of joy, not just a person. The concept of joy and the person, a lady named Joy, play a huge role in Lewis's life. So how is joy different than happiness or pleasure? So that's something you just got to, I'm not really going to give you that answer. It's something you got to reflect on. Second, discuss the role of G.E. Cowie and William Kirkpatrick. These were both teachers in Lewis's life. Discuss the role in his pursuit of truth and how much influence should a teacher have in the life of a student. Third, discuss how the Inklings, you'll meet them soon, shaped Lewis's thinking and writing. How important are friendships like this in your life? And finally, discuss what C.S. Lewis means by being a translator of Christian doctrine. How does this relate to our role of being witnesses of the gospel in the 21st century? So, with those questions in mind, let's begin. C.S. Lewis, you all ready? You excited? Happy? Yes. Sleepy? Gonna make it? Okay, cool. All right, here we go. So first, my kind of my story, my journey with C.S. Lewis. I was a youth pastor in the late 1990s and early 2000s, and there were 3 requirements to be a youth pastor during that time. One, you had to be able to play guitar. You had to be able to grow a goatee, and you had to be able to quote C.S. Lewis, right? Well, I could never play guitar, so that was out. So my ceiling for youth ministry was only so high. I could grow a fairly sweet goatee, which I wore for way too long. And I could quote C.S. Lewis with the best of them, right? Had a book of C.S. Lewis quotes. I would look them up, work them into conversations whenever I could, work them into youth ministry sermons whenever I could. But I had a dirty little secret when it came to C.S. Lewis. I had never actually read anything by him other than quotes. I was a fraud. I was a phony, just a big fat fake, quoting C.S. Lewis as if I was knowledgeable of what he had actually written. Well, I exposed my little secret in a staff meeting, maybe my first or second year here. And you guys may remember Mr. Mulvihill and Kranz. And we were just kind of talking, and they were talking about Mere Christianity, which is a book, if you have not read, every one of you should read it. I think Holland's reading it right now. it slipped. I didn't mean to say it out loud, but I found myself saying I couldn't quite reel those words back in. But I actually said, I've never actually read C.S. Lewis. And they both turned and looked at me, right? They get, that crinkled nose, like somebody just farted in the room, and you're looking and you're like, what just happened, right? They gave me that look, and the overwhelming sense of shame I had realizing my peers were judging me for being a big fraud, having quoted C.S. Lewis but never having actually read him. So I went about correcting that. I read Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe first, fell in love with it, followed very quickly by Mere Christianity, and then while reading Mere Christianity, I'm like, oh, now I get it. Because all of the other Christian authors that I love, every time I'm, almost every page in Mere Christianity, I'm like, oh, I've heard this before. Oh, I've heard this before. It's because everybody else is quoting C.S. Lewis. So I was a late bloomer when it actually came to reading C.S. Lewis, but I'm glad I finally got to it. And I hope at some point you guys do go maybe even beyond, read Narnia if you haven't, but I do hope you go beyond Narnia. For those honor students, you're going to enjoy Great Divorce. Bless you. You okay?
Yeah, I'm
good.
good.
All right. Honor students, I hope you enjoy Great Divorce, and all of you at some point in your life, please read Mere Christianity. Right? So, C.S. Lewis. He was born November 29th, 1898, and this might be a surprise for most of you. He was actually born in Belfast, Ireland. I think a lot of times we think of Lewis as an Englishman, but really throughout his life he saw himself as a misplaced Irishman. And he died on November 22nd, 1963, in his home. In fact, you will get to visit the room. It's not like a chalk outline or anything, but you can actually see the spot where C.S. Lewis crumpled to the floor and they realized he had died. Now, that date should sound familiar to you. November 22nd, 1963. What else happened that day? Anybody know? I think U.S. history. Who? I heard it. Yeah, JFK. Yeah, good job, Zetzi. Yeah, same day that JFK was shot. Obviously, much bigger news than C.S. Lewis's death. And for some of you, if you've read Brave New World by Aldous Huxley, he also died on that same day. So quite a day for pretty famous deaths. His parents were Albert James Lewis. He was a police court solicitor. And Flora Augusta Hamilton. I'm going to need my glasses here. Sorry, guys. She was a graduate of Queen's College in mathematics and logic, right? So it was Albert who ultimately wanted his sons to be educated in English schools. So when his older brother Warren, who was known as Warnie, right? When Lewis was young, Warnie was sent to study at the Wynyard School just north of London. So C.S. Lewis would be tutored early in his life by his mother and by a governess. Now, think of his mother here, right? His mother was schooled in mathematics and logic. So very early, Lewis's earliest education was in the ideas of logic, proper reasoning, and it was those early lessons from his mom that would carry with him throughout his life. Now his name. Most of you guys have heard me talk about C.S. Lewis a little bit through class. What does C.S. stand for? Anybody remember? Clive Staples. Excellent. Good job, guys. Yeah, Clive and Staples were both family names that he hated. He did not like the name Clive. So if you just refer to him as Clive or C.S., nobody would know who you were talking about because he went by a much different name. He went by the name Jack. Jaxie was his little dog when he was 4 years old that suddenly died. I've read a couple different accounts of how the dog died. I couldn't find it again specifically, but Jaxie dies when he's 4 years old. And as a 4-year-old, C.S. Lewis declares, "I will forth be known as Jaxie." Right? So his parents went along with it. And eventually Jaxie would get shortened to Jack. But all of his friends and family, including Warnie, would refer to him as Jack, or in writing, just as Jay, throughout the rest of his life. By the way, just so you're pacing yourself here, we're going to get through Lewis's conversion. See a little sign that says a trip to the zoo. I'll get through his conversion story, and then we'll take a break. Greta should be back with donuts, I think, at that point, and then we'll finish the lecture after that. So he announced when he's 4 he would be known as Jackson. Now, it's this concept of joy, right? And this is kind of the first discussion question here that I want you to kind of focus in on this point. It's this concept of joy that Lewis would describe as the central theme or the central story of his life, right? Let me give you a definition of joy. Joy is a sensation that encapsulates the whole of the presence of God. Joy is different from happiness or pleasure, and it's key to all relationships with the divine. So Lewis would have 3 experiences with this concept of joy. Very different, in a sense, very strange and cerebral experiences that would influence him throughout the rest of his life. The first was when he was 7 years old, and he was playing in the garden, right? In Ireland, just playing in the garden. And he was overwhelmed with this sense of desire, right? As a 7-year-old, he was aware of this. And here's how he described it. He said, "It's difficult to find words strong enough for this sensation which came over me." So some sort of sensation. He just, as a 7-year-old, he recognized, I'm feeling something. I'm experiencing something here. And he said it was a sensation of desire. He said, but before he knew what he desired, the desire itself was gone. This is a 7-year-old reflecting on this experience. And so what he came to realize was he wanted, listen to this, it's confusing, but he wanted the want itself, right? I know that doesn't make a ton of sense, but it was this desire, and it was almost like it was fleeting. It just came upon him all of a sudden, and then it was gone, and it was the search after that desire which he longed for. Well, the next 2 experiences would come from 2 very different books. The first was from Beatrix Potter's Squirrel Nutkin, right? Now, Beatrix Potter is really popular now with what? What movie just came out? Oh, you don't know. Anybody know what movie just came out? Peter Rabbit. Anybody go see Peter Rabbit? It's in theaters, right? You haven't seen Peter Rabbit? Go see Peter Rabbit. In fact, our last day in England, we go to Williamsburg. We go on a Wordsworth walk. We get the best gingerbread you will ever eat. Have you figured out this is a food trip, not just a literature trip? You figured that out. We take a nice little cruise on Lake Windermere, and I forget the name of the town. My wife knows it. But the town we end up in is where Beatrix Potter is from, so it's probably going to be a lot of Peter Rabbit stuff you're going to see here. But her short story, Squirrel Nutkin, actually follows Peter Rabbit, and it's about the squirrel named Nutkin, right? Being chased by an owl known as Old Brown, right? So Lewis is reading this book, and here's what he said. He said, "It created a crush and a confusion in me. And the crush was this. He wanted to know autumn. Think about that. To know the season of autumn. But also to possess autumn. But he came with this question, how can one possess a season? And it was this experience reading this book that just brought him joy. And the third experience was reading American poet Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's epic poem, The Song of King Olaf. Any history buffs in here, you might also know that is Teddy Roosevelt's favorite poem. But here were the lines that were so influential to Lewis. This is from the poem. "I heard a voice that cried, 'Balder the beautiful is dead, is dead.' And through the misty air passed like the mournful way of sunward sailing cranes." And here's what Lewis said. "I knew nothing about Balder, but instantly I was uplifted into huge regions of northern sky. I desired with almost sickening intensity something never to be described, and then, as in the other examples, I found myself at the very same moment already falling out of that desire and wishing I were back in it. He said these three experiences of joy would form the central story of his life, and that ultimately his life was about nothing else than the pursuit of joy, right? So it was not long after these experiences, especially reading Olaf, that his mother would be diagnosed with cancer, and she would pass away. August 23rd, 1908. So Lewis loses his mother as a 10-year-old. And think about it. These three experiences happened prior to being 10 years old. So very reflective, very thoughtful young man already. So after Flora's death, Lewis would be sent to London, to the Windward School, with his brother. And it was this abandonment almost. Not really abandonment, it's kind of exile. Really. He wasn't left, he was sent, right? It was this exile to England, which would create strife between Lewis and his father for the rest of his father's life. In fact, it was here where he really felt this feeling of exile and being in a place that was not his home. And some people believe that it was in being sent to London that he caught his first glimpses of Narnia. Being sent to that place where, longing for a place where he was not yet living. So in 1911, C.S. Lewis attended a small preparatory school called Cherbourg House, probably mispronouncing that. And it was here at Cherbourg where Lewis would first begin to lose his faith. So I think we're on 2B here, education. And he was introduced to school matron G.E. Cowie. All right, so think of this 10, 11-year-old, very vulnerable young man, right, who's just lost his mother, who is living in a place far from home, and it was Cowie, the school matron, who, as Lewis would describe, little by little, she loosened the whole framework, talking of his faith. She blunted all the sharp edges of my belief. Can't do it. The whole thing became a matter of speculation. And he found himself saying, I believe, to one does feel. So little by little, this school matron would just kind of whittle away at Lewis's faith as a very, very young man. Well, in 1914, Lewis would arrive at Lurgan College, and he would come under the stuttering, I'm going too fast, let me slow down. He'd come under the tutelage of a man named William Thompson Kirkpatrick, right? Now, if you have read the Narnia books, especially Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, what sounds familiar about Kirkpatrick? Anybody? That was a deep trivia question right there.
Thompson.
What's that?
Thompson.
Thompson? No?
No,
Evil
I
Queen.
thought that was the name.
No. When the children arrive, think Lion, Witch, and Wardrobe.
Oh,
Evil Queen.
Remember not Tumnus. The professor at whose home they arrive? He was Professor Kirk, right? And Professor Kirk is somewhat modeled after Professor Kirkpatrick, that Lewis would describe as an atheist of the pessimistic kind, right? So Kirkpatrick would not only educate Lewis, but he would mold him and shape his mind into a powerhouse of reason, logic, and argumentation, which would guide Lewis's thought processes for the rest of his life. Kirkpatrick demanded sound argument and justification for any claims made, shaped a reliance on proof, evidence, and realism. So in lessons, as he was getting Lewis to defend the things that he was trying to explain, all of a sudden Kirkpatrick would put up his hand and go, stop, and get him to really fully explain what it was that he was trying to say. And once it was satisfactory enough, he would say, go on, right? And so you can almost imagine this almost individual education process. Kirkpatrick saying, stop, Explain yourself. What do you mean by this? And once it's fully explained, he would then say, okay, now you may go on. It was ultimately 3 years that Lewis would sit under Kirkpatrick as a pupil. Lewis said, Kirk excited and satisfied one side of me, the proof-loving, evidence-demanding view of the universe. Later, after Lewis had become a Christian, he would write this in Mere Christianity. God is no fonder of intellectual slackers than of any other slackers. If you are thinking of becoming a Christian, I warn you, you are embarking on something which is going to take the whole of you, brains and all. So June of 1917, as you most likely know, was moving towards the end of World War I. Lewis enlists in the army. He very quickly finds himself fighting in the trenches of World War I in France. He would be injured here. He'd carry this pain with him throughout the rest of his life. But it was here in the trenches where he met his roommates, who would become his best friend, and they made a mutual promise together. His name was Paddy Moore. They found themselves in the trenches together and basically made a promise to him that if anything happened to Paddy, that Lewis would care for his mother, Janie Moore, and his sister, Maureen. Well, Paddy was killed in battle. Lewis was injured and sent back home. And so after he returned back to England, Lewis would find himself living with the Moores from 1921 until Mrs. Moore's death in 1951. Okay? Mrs. Moore. Now, you got to think, Mrs. Moore is the mom, right? Janie Moore is the older mom, whereas Maureen was similar to his age. But it's with Mrs. Moore, Mrs. Janie Moore, right, that this relationship is a bit of a mystery, right? It remains, Lewis would never really speak of the true nature of this relationship. I'm flying through this. She's not going to be back with donuts, but we'll see. The nature of their relationship remains a mystery. Now, Warney, the brother, hated Mrs. Moore. He could not stand her, and when he later writes about Jack and their relationship, he is very unflattering to Mrs. Moore in his diary. Now, she was an atheist, but she was the kind of atheist like this, where I don't believe in God, and that's why I hate him. We meet a lot of atheists like that something tragic has happened in their life, and so they use that tragedy as a meaning of disbelief. So ultimately, she does not believe in God, but she, at the same time, blames God for her son Paddy's death. Now, there's speculation that there may have been a romantic relationship between Lewis and Mrs. Moore, but there's no evidence for it because ultimately he never spoke about it, even with Warney or his father. Excuse me. When she died in 1951, here is how Warney described it. He said, Jack has been freed from his self-imposed slavery. So very unflattering to Mrs. Moore. So moving into his conversion story. Okay. Lewis's atheism began to crumble around the time his father became ill in the late 1920s. He read a book by a British author and theologian, Catholic theologian named G.K. Chesterton. Reads a book called The Everlasting Man. And for the first time, Lewis, first time at least in his adult life, Lewis is presented with a logical, reasonable view of Christianity. It shocked him. He was not prepared to encounter a intelligible story of Christ. Upon reading this book, he saw the whole Christian outline of history. and he sat out in a form that seemed to make sense. And he says, a young man who wishes to remain an atheist cannot be too careful in what he reads. Now, at the same time, his friends Owen Barfield, Hugo Dyson, and the one you are most likely all familiar with, J.R.R. Tolkien, they were helping him find the answers to questions which bothered him for so long. So it was this role, and I think this is question 3 in here. It was this role of these friends in his life, all Christians, Barfield, Tolkien, and Dyson, all Christians who, and very, intelligent men, who would just begin to kind of chip away at Lewis's atheism. So first, Owen Barfield gets the credit for dealing Lewis with the blow to his logic, right? Lewis suffered from what he called chronological snobbery, right? We do this too, is we think our generation is way smarter than the previous generation, right? Y'all get that. Our parents are so stupid they don't get it, right? Well, every generation thinks that. Especially if you are thinking, surely our time, 21st century, is way more intelligent than the first century, right? It's a, should back donuts? Yay, good. All right. We have this chronological snobbery where we think we have to have been smarter than those people way back then. Well, Barfield challenges Lewis on that. He said that's just not the case. You read these old philosophers, you read Plato and Aristotle, you read this stuff and you appreciate their intellect. Why can't you appreciate the intellect of these writings? And then Barfield got him here. Barfield challenges Lewis on the view that the universe had to be observed, by the 5 senses. And so this forced Lewis to concede that there must be a mind behind creation. There must be some intelligible, not a being that you can touch, smell, taste, hear, not that sort of being, but there had to be a mind, and that mind he ultimately calls God. So it's Barfield, get this, who would shift Lewis from atheism to theism, right? He makes that very important move to saying, you know what, there is no God, but there had to be a mind behind something, and he calls that mind God. Now, scholars today might call that intelligent design, right? Then it's Dyson and Tolkien, who would deliver the final blow. September 19th, 1931. Here's how Lewis described it. What Dyson and Tolkien showed me was that the idea of a dying and rising God that appealed to me, provided I find it anywhere except in the Gospels. You got to remember, Lewis was an author of medieval literature. He loved these myths. He loved those stories. He loved these stories, and they challenged him. They're like, why do you like these stories everywhere you find it except in the Gospels? And Lewis's logic and reasoning finally got to him, and he did not have a good answer for this. And so ultimately he came to this conclusion. He said the story of Christ is simply a true myth. It's a myth working on us like all of the others do, but with this tremendous difference: it really happened. And so it was Dyson and Tolkien who ultimately chip away at Lewis's atheism. So just about 10 days later, Lewis is riding in a sidecar. So picture those old motorcycles with the little sidecar, right? Can you picture that? Warney's driving the motorcycle. I know some of my best praying has been in the car while other people are driving. And so you got to imagine maybe that's what's going on, right? So Lewis is riding in the sidecar of this motorcycle, and they're going to the zoo. And here's the way Lewis describes it. When we set out, I did not believe that Jesus Christ was the Son of God. But when we reached the zoo, I did. So it was something that happened in that sidecar in that motorcycle. While Lewis is just left with his own thoughts and probably crying out to God, if you get there safely, I'll obey. But something in that sidecar, Lewis began as a skeptic. And by the time they got to the zoo, he could say, I now believe. Right? So, we'll take a break there. Looks like donuts, Entenmann's, yeah, about 10 minutes. Credit?
15.
Here? Okay, cool. Did you pause it, Jack?
Oh.